So when government started telling people to stay at home to slow the spread of COVID-19, advocates for women warned about the dangers for people who'd be stuck inside with their abusive partners. They said that we would see a rise in domestic violence. Now, we're about 2 months into this, and there's more and more data that suggests that they were right.
I mean, violence against women, gender-based violence was already a pandemic. And so what we've got now is we have a pandemic on top of a pandemic.
Earlier today, the head of the WHO's European office said that calls to domestic violence hotlines have gone up by 5 times since the start of the outbreak, and that if lockdowns were to continue for 6 months, there could be another 31 million cases of gender-based violence around the world. Today on the show, why domestic violence is flourishing under lockdown conditions. I'm talking to freelance journalist Sarah Boesveld. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More.
Late March and early April, I got some really shocking news for me because I'd heard about a domestic homicide that happened in a town near where I grew up. It was Brockville, Ontario. A woman was killed by her partner in her home. This partner had a gun. This woman her name was Audrey Hopkinson, Brockville, Ontario. She's 33. She's pregnant with her third child.
The investigation is being treated as a homicide and suicide.
We can confirm that the people were involved in a domestic relationship.
One of the kids was actually in the home at the time of this murder, and another wasn't there, thank God. But that just sat with me, and so horrible because it's just.
Sarah's been reporting on the rise of domestic violence in the time of COVID-19, and she's talking about the disturbing spike in women being killed by their domestic partners that we've seen since the start of the lockdowns in Canada.
Then I saw again, and the next headline right after that, a 41-year-old woman near Sundre, Alberta, was killed. It was a murder-suicide as well, but she was killed in her home. Then Tracy McKenzie of Hammond Plains, Nova Scotia, she was killed in her home. And there is a man who has been charged with premeditating her murder.
In early April, Tracy McKenzie's body was found in her Nova Scotia home. Immediately, prosecutors called it a case of domestic homicide.
And then since then, there have been homicides in New Brunswick. There was one that happened last weekend in Hillsborough, New Brunswick, that involved a 49-year-old man killing a 43-year-old woman. And the police said that, the accused lived in the same home as the victim.
And then, of course, there was the Nova Scotia shooting.
There were the headlines in the week after the shooting that this sort of all was set off after the gunman assaulted his partner.
Here's what we know. There was a party, and we know that the shooter and his girlfriend were at that party. And at that point, Mr. Wortman began to argue with his domestic partner, with his girlfriend. At some point, they left and went back to his cottage, which was nearby to where the party was being held. At that point, he escalated and became violent. He assaulted his girlfriend, he tied her up, and she managed to escape and run into the woods.
Not to say that, if she had just succumbed, he wouldn't have gone on to kill as many people as he did. There's a lot of misogyny that has still been in the reaction to that.
And then there are all the incidents and fears of domestic violence that haven't made the news.
In late March, the stay-at-home orders had just come into place, and I was talking to Pamela Cross, who is the legal director of Luke's Place, which is a not-for-profit that helps abused women dealing with custody and access issues. And she was telling me some pretty chilling anecdotes, and one of them involved a woman that had called and asked them for some help, and she was really concerned for her safety. She said that she had a custody arrangement with her ex, in which the deal was that he brought their child to a police station, a local police station, for a handover, right? Instead of going to their home to pick him up, it was this cop shop that they went to. And so she was all upset because her ex had said, look, it's dangerous out there. It's COVID-19. We've been told to stay at home. I don't want to go to the cop shop and drop off our child. You're going to have to come here if you want to get him. And to her, there was an air of a threat to that feeling. And she asked Pam Cross and her team at Luke's Place to give her some assistance. The courts are not in session at this point. The custody deal was still good, but he refused. And so they did some safety planning together, and they had to do an emergency hearing. And I actually don't know how that case resolved. And I think about it a lot. I look at the headlines and I think, is that, is in any story that we've seen of a child or a woman killed, like, could that be it? Could that be any sort of case that is not in the headlines? Because there are a lot of them, so we're hearing about cases like that where COVID is sort of used as a chip. And that one really stuck with me because there are a lot of reasons during this time that you see COVID used as kind of like a reason for this abuse to happen.
Right. So you wrote about how COVID-19 and calls for people to stay home are making the issue of domestic violence worse. So can you start with what we know about what's been happening, and then we'll get into why this is happening after?
Sure. So early on, when COVID was kind of just creeping in the wings, we had, life continuing as normal, shops were open, schools were open. Advocates were warning about this. They had seen other countries, certainly Europe, having all of the shutdown orders in place. And there were concerns that when you stay home with an abuser, this problem could get worse. And so we have seen that come to pass in Canada. We have seen spikes in domestic violence. There is a real demand for shelter space, but there is also, on the flip side, an eerie lowering of calls to domestic violence advocates and places that do provide help and support for people who are experiencing violence. Spikes in domestic violence calls to the police certainly are, first responders are still busy during this time, even though people are staying at home. And that's the first thing that they saw a jump in.
Battered Women's Support Services has been hit with a 300% increase in calls over the last 3 weeks alone.
We're getting calls from children and youth who have, they've witnessed their mother's abuse for their lifetime. Now they're under this social isolation scenario, and they're checking in about what options they have.
I was seeing some reports of doubling and tripling, certainly in Toronto and sort of Toronto, Vancouver, areas where there is more population, like a higher concentration of people living together. And yeah, there have been some drops in calls in more rural prairie places. Certainly there have been lower cases reported in the Maritimes, on the prairies, but they're seeing this drop in calls as something to be worried about.
Havery says they haven't seen an increase in calls for assistance, and she says that is worrisome. She equates the current situation to the holiday season.
The quiet before Christmas, where we don't see the increase of women calling to come into the shelter. They're sort of getting through the holiday season with their family. And then after the holidays, we're extremely busy.
And what I was hearing from one woman I spoke with in Manitoba was, no, that's not a sign that things are better. That's a sign that people are heeding that advice to stay home. And they're seeing the danger of COVID-19 as greater than the danger that they might be facing in their abusive situation. And I think a lot of the shelters in Canada are trying to get the word out that home, being the safest place to be in the public messaging around COVID does not apply to you if you are facing an abusive situation. Go get help. We're seeing a doubling of traffic from this year over last in March for the shelter sites. There's a site called sheltersafe.ca, and that's a site where you can look on a map and find a shelter in your area. And the folks who run that were telling me that that's concerning to just see the demand really increase. And also we've had more concentrated spurts of murders, homicides that are related to gender-based violence. So since isolation started, there had been at least 3 women who were murdered, like less than 2 weeks. And that was when I wrote this column for Chatelaine, which was prior to the Nova Scotia shootings, in which there were a lot more women killed. And so The Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, which is kind of our national watchdog on this issue, said that an average of 9 women were killed in the month of March between 2016 and 2019. And so 3 women killed in just a matter of days. That was just troubling to see because 1 woman is killed every 6 days in Canada by an intimate partner or for reasons of where her gender is involved. And so I think like this concentration has been really troubling for sure. And we can't detach it from the sort of conditions that we're all living in right now.
And what about around the rest of the world? I know that the UN has called this a shadow pandemic.
They have, yeah. It is, they've issued a really, really strong call. I was surprised to see how strong the language was. They kind of used sort of like warlike terms, right?
I appealed for an end to violence everywhere now. But violence is not confined to the battlefield. For many women and girls, the threat looms largest where they should be safest, in their own homes.
They said we need a ceasefire on gender-based violence around the world. I just saw a headline today about a doubling in domestic violence in Russia, even though the police were saying that there had been a 13% drop in violent crime. And it was the human rights ombudsperson who raised the alarm on that. But absolutely, in countries around the world, we're seeing an increase in domestic violence and a lot more deaths associated with this kind of violence too.
WHO is deeply troubled by the reports from many countries, including Belgium, Bulgaria, France, Ireland, Russian Federation, Spain, UK, and others. Although data is scarce, member states are reporting up to a 60% increase in emergency calls by women subjected to violence by their intimate partners.
What kinds of calls are these women's organizations getting? Are they different from the kinds of calls that they usually get? Are they worse in terms of severity?
Yeah, the shelters have reported more severe cases, which to them indicates that women are not going to get help unless they are in severe physical danger and have been severely harmed or their children have been harmed. And so they're also seeing really interesting cases of women who are concerned about being watched online. You know, that is certainly a quality of abuse. You know, a factor of abuse is control and surveillance. And I'm not talking about like an increase in the use of spyware or anything that like necessarily tracks people, though we know some abusers do use those tools. But just the mere fact of like you're at home under the same roof with this person.
Right.
You're maybe trying to have a Zoom call with a friend. It's probably difficult to go somewhere private for that. That's just not available to a lot of women right now. They're having to find really creative ways to access some of these folks who've been abused and these services that are on the other end trying to help. They're having to kind of come up with little codes or find some more sort of off the radar ways to connect with women. And so that's been a difference in how they're actually able to contact women. We also know statistically that the most dangerous time for a woman who's being abused is when she attempts to leave the person. So women are factoring all of this in as well, right? And leaving. And so the demand is higher, the calls are more severe, and it's sort of butting up against this eerie drop in some places of actually reaching out for help because COVID has sort of cast a layer of difficulty, a barrier between women who need help and those services.
Right. So we've touched on some of this already, but what do we know about why this is happening?
Yeah, well, there is a strong correlation between abuse that is maybe simmering or ongoing in more subtle ways and economic upheaval, any sort of stress in someone's life. So we know that when stress is exacerbated, then in people who are abusers and don't have the proper tools to deal with that stress, they take it out on that person that they've decided they would like to control and they would like to sort of have under their thumb and make miserable because that's, you know, a way that they might get some sort of power felt back. And you know, we're seeing a ton of layoffs.
At least 1 million people in Canada lost their jobs in March, an unprecedented number, pushing the unemployment rate to 7.8%.
Another tension in this whole mix is having children at home. You know, you're exhausted caring for that child. If you're expected to teach that child from home, doing this distance learning thing that's been in the mix now, that's an additional pressure, never mind figuring out how to feed them. We're seeing people, with stressful custody situations, perhaps like the one I described. We're seeing elevated levels of stress, and that's a pressure cooker. So I've had advocates tell me that this is a perfect storm, certainly because of that societal stress, the opportunity as well that an abuser has to have the person that they're abusing around all the time. And also, like any of us in, cohabiting with another person right now, there are tensions anyway. And so just imagine if there was somebody who manipulated you, who, made you feel amazing one minute and horrible the next, and maybe physically harmed you. Just think about like what a terrorizing situation that would be. So that's what I'm hearing is the main reason for increases in violence. And certainly the uncertainty of the situation really does not help. Like, when is this all going to be over? When am I ever going to find a job again? And it's making a lot of women feel pretty hopeless and finding exit from their situation.
Yeah. And social isolation is one of the most common tactics that abusers will use to sort of distance survivors from their support networks, right? Can you talk a bit about that and how they use social isolation in general?
Yeah, so that's a classic sign of abuse. If you know of anyone in your life that has a partner that is jealous, maybe feels a bit insecure if, your friend or your loved one goes out on their own, that's a tactic. That is, yes, maybe their insecurity coming through, but if they tell their partner that they feel that way, maybe her inclination is to please and to be like, oh, I don't want you to feel that way. So they'll stay home more. They'll only stay with that person more. Or they'll state opinions about loved ones and friends and kind of trying to turn that support network against the person that they're trying to manipulate. So there's all kinds of strategies that abusers use to isolate, because if their target is isolated, then they have all the opportunity in the world to abuse them and to gaslight them in a lot of ways, right? Like to make them think that this is normal behavior and to make them think that, this person really cares about them. They just get mad every now and then, or this person, really loves me so much, but, has a little bit of a temper or just likes to be around me a lot. And there's a lot of ways that abusers capitalize on some of our fairy tale notions of what romance is and looks like. So if you've ever seen or heard the podcast or read the article or seen the series of Dirty John, that's a really good example of how someone gets isolated and manipulated, because it just kind of devolves into a place where you've developed emotions and you've developed a strong attachment to them at the expense of some of your other relationships, and voila, social isolation. So think about it as, a great advantage for an abuser if they've been doing this work already, and then you are not allowed out in the world to interact with people in your life outside of this house.
Right. So basically one of their main weapons is being handed to them on a silver platter.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's really chilling.
We'll be right back.
So you have women being forced to stay at home with abusive partners. Their violent tendencies are sort of inflamed by economic stressors, kids being at home, all that stuff. And then on top of that, emergency services and shelter systems and social services are overwhelmed and underfunded, right? Can you tell me about that side of things and the response to all of this?
Yeah, when I was preparing this shadowing column, when I was reporting it, one thing that stuck out to me was all of the pressure points that existed pre-COVID-19 pandemic have been just completely exploded by this, and exposed by this. There is chronic underfunding already for shelter systems. There has been a overwhelming demand for shelters for years. So a May 2019 report from Women's Shelters Canada found that 4 in 10 women's shelters were operating at capacity, quote, almost always. That was a year ago before any of this happened. And it also just sort of shows that there's nothing in place to happen after the shelter visit. You're not supposed to stay there for weeks and months and, certainly not years after. But what that report found as well, that was that 74% of shelters let women overstay whatever the province kind of says is appropriate to stay in shelter, like that period of time, because they don't have anywhere else to go. So what does that expose for us? Wow, there's no plan for affordable housing for women leaving abusive situations, That's been the demand that felt eerily familiar when I asked these shelters, like, what is it that you need funding for? We have seen a little bit of funding from the federal government and some provincial governments since this happened.
That's why we've invested $40 million for women's shelters and sexual assault centers across the country, and for Indigenous women and children fleeing violence.
So what they said that they needed is, some sort of plan for this to get them into like hotels or some overflow space, because, we have to be spread apart in order to have social distancing happen. A lot of shelters have rooms that families share, and so they're having to make them one family bedrooms, for example. Families are having meals in their rooms instead of in common areas. They're staggering time that can be used for common spaces so that one person's using it at once and then they go in and clean it and the next family can use it. And so the affordable housing situation comes into play. Certainly the salaries and the working conditions for staff. There are a lot of people working around the clock to make sure women are safe. That was a problem before, right? We know that in the Harper years, the funding was sort of clawed back, and then there was a reinstatement of some of that for grassroots women's organizations under Justin Trudeau. But again, it has been quite limited. And they also the demand was also there for cleaning supplies, which is, I think, true across the board. I think the pressure points in the system have really been shown during COVID-19. And that to me indicates that there is some real soul searching that we have to do and some real systemic rebuilding and solutions that we have to bring in place after this is over. Domestic violence is sort of one of those really insidious, ongoing things that just kind of happen under the radar all the time. And I think those indications that these issues were there prior to COVID is a real wake-up call for us, or should be for sure.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that's the show. But before we go, just a quick note on the conspiracy theory that we talked about last week, that 5G causes COVID-19. We talked about how people were lighting cell towers on fire in Europe. Well, now people are also doing it in Canada. Quebec police arrested a man and a woman in their 20s this week after the 6th and 7th cell tower fires in the Montreal region. If you want to know more about why people are doing this and other conspiracy theories, check out our episode from April 28th. That's all for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.